Welcome to the Prophecy Club. You know, we have had some really strange weather lately. Why is that? What is going on with the weather? Would you believe that there is a secret weapon that the Americans tried to perfect, but they couldn't perfect it? I understand that we have a basic math calculation in our understanding of math, and it will not allow us to calculate it out. However, the Russians don't have that problem. And the Russians have perfected this to the nth degree, and it may very well be, it certainly explains a lot of our strange weather. Now, what am I talking about? I'm talking about scalar wave. It was first invented by Nikola Tesla, and I'm about to have Bill Schnoebelen come on and tell you all about it, so I won't take all of his thunder. But the point is, this scalar wave can go around the globe, and it basically leaves one spot and then appears in another spot. It can make large amounts of the atmosphere very hot or very cold. Well, so what does that do? Well, you make something very hot, the very large amount of the atmosphere, and what do you cause? A tornado or a hurricane. Or you make it very cold and you bring in massive amounts of snow and ice and things like that. So that can really cause havoc in an economy and in a nation. And it is, let's put it this way, I'm not the only one that believes that the Russians have probably been using this on us and other nations for a long time. Then there's the other explanation about the birds. You remember, here a couple of years ago, there was reports of birds just falling, entire flocks, just falling out of the air, dead. They were dead by the time they hit the ground, okay? What is that? That can't be some disease. You can't get a whole flock of birds to die in mid-flight. And then, of course, we also had millions of fish washing up upon the shores of lakes and some streams. What is all that? Well, let me just explain. All of that can be caused by scalar wave. Scalar wave can destroy anything in the air, on the ground, on the sea, under the sea, any place on the globe, anytime they want, and here's the kicker, there's very little residue to let you know that this is what has done it. Matter of fact, there are a lot of people that believe that's what took out the Challenger, okay, scalar wave. But this information is really powerful and really important, so much so that instead of asking $30 for this DVD, you can get it today for only $15 by calling your Prophecy Club, 785-266-1112. More on that later. Now, Bill Schnoebelen in Russia's secret weapon to defeat America.
And that Mind Snapper name is pretty evocative. I don't think we need to define that. We'll talk more about each of these in a second. Now, you'll see there on that graphic, that's a drawing of a Tesla globe that has been, it's called a 3D scalar interferometry hemispherical shell that has been placed over a city or over a battlefield, doesn't really matter, and nothing can get through that. In the drawing, you see jets, you see missiles hitting it, and just exploding on impact. And this is called the famous Tesla globe, or Tesla shell. And the way this works is if you make one of these, it's about 50 miles in diameter. It has incredible power. And if something hits it, it just basically, it's kind of like those bug zappers you have on your back porch in the summertime, and a mosquito hits it and bzzz, Well, if a missile hits this thing, it just instantly disintegrates. It melts in just a blaze of plasma. There's nothing left of it. Now, that's at 50-mile diameter. If you attenuate it, if you make it bigger, if you make it about 100 miles in diameter, and that's enough to cover any city, then it isn't quite as powerful. But what happens is, if there's an incoming missile or an incoming bomber or whatever, it hits the shield, and as soon as it hits the shield, an EM pulse duds everything in the missile or in the bomber, so it's totally useless. The nuclear material in it is rendered useless, and it just drops to the earth like a rock. So nothing can get through this. Now, this also can be transmitted across vast distances with no intervening travel. So if they have a scalar device, let's say in Moscow, and they see that for whatever reason we're deciding we're going to bomb Cuba, we're firing nuclear missiles at Cuba, they could just push a button and in a couple of seconds, boink, there's this shield over Cuba, just to give you one example. Now, additionally, you can use these same globes, as I have mentioned, as a detonating device. So, and the exothermic blast from these things can be nearly nuclear in nature. It can use lesser levels of power to simply destroy all electronic devices. We've already mentioned that. That is called dudding. Now, there's endothermic mode. This is the opposite. And here you create what is called a cold explosion. Now, that sounds kind of like, what? You know, a cold explosion? But remember, that was what was felt right after the earthquake in Yugoslavia. The way this works is it just draws all the heat energy out of the atmosphere in just a matter of a few seconds. And I don't know if any of you have seen that movie last year. It was called The Day After Tomorrow. And it was like, you know, kind of about this weather apocalypse. And they had this one scene where this, like, storm came in over New York, almost like a freezing hurricane. And wherever the eye of this hurricane came, it was like the temperature would drop like 150 degrees in a matter of 2 or 3 minutes. And everything just froze solid, you know. And it was like you were flash frozen if you were out in that. And they can do that with this weapon, this endothermic mode. They could put this, and of course, if you drop the temperature that low, you're putting a lot of things into an area where they're getting near absolute zero. And that means metal gets brittle, tanks will shatter, buildings were shattered, steel girders were shattered. Then they did actually test this thing on April 9th, 1984, off the Kuril Islands, off the Sea of Japan. And what happened is an airplane, a Japanese airliner, was flying over this particular area, and they saw all of a sudden this enormous thunderhead develop to the level of 60,000 feet in 2 minutes. Because what it did is it pulled, when it's cold, it like sucks moisture out of the atmosphere. You know, it gets real cold and it's dry. What happened was it just sucked vast amounts of water out of the ocean and created this 60,000 foot high thunderhead that was 200 miles in diameter in less than 2 minutes. This thing was so big that essentially the people in the airliner thought it was a nuclear explosion. It happened so fast, except there was no light flash. So again, that's something that's quite scary. Now, the Mind Snapper mode is even worse, to my mind, because, we can kind of understand, okay, you blow things up, you have a shield, you make things cold, but this is where you're actually messing with the human mind, with your mind, perhaps. At a low level, this weapon can cause people to lose consciousness. Raising the level put people into a trance, and they become hypnotized, and they'll do anything you tell them to do. At the high level, all living things in a target area would instantly fall down dead. And I mean everything. The Russians used this in Afghanistan, this weapon, against the Mujahideen, back when they were fighting them in the 80s. And there's this one village, and I remember seeing this on the news, where every person in the village was dead. And even after 2 weeks, there was no decomposition. There was no decay, because all the organisms in the body were killed. All the bacteria were killed. All the bugs were killed. Every animal, every microscopic organism in that entire village was dead. So there was nothing to begin the normal natural process that happens with dead material. That's pretty scary stuff, folks. You could also fake religious phenomenon. And what I mean by that is, back in the 70s, we called it metaprogramming the human biocomputer. In other words, think of your mind as a hard drive. You can erase the hard drive and then reformat it with new software. And instead of, having faith in Christ, instead, you now have faith in the Antichrist. And you see, the only defense against this sort of thing is if you have the helmet of salvation on, and if you're all armored up, and if you're praying and keeping in the blood of Jesus every single day. That's the only defense against this sort of thing. The other thing that can happen, you have normal people, whatever they are, seeing things, having hallucinations. It's almost like beaming an LSD trip into your mind. And you can have them see giant 3D visions in the sky. You could see a 1,000-foot Jesus. You could see a giant apparition of the Virgin Mary, or a huge vision of Lord Maitreya. It doesn't matter. Whatever it might be, you can induce these things. And this is the bottom line here. The Bible warns us about how the elect could indeed be deceived. And this is what I'm afraid of here, is this could happen. It's important to realize that recently scientists that study the brain have discovered what they call the God part of the brain. Now, this is kind of extraordinary information because what they did is they went out and they took many different people from many different faiths who were very devout, Christians, Jews, Buddhists, whatever, that were extremely devout in their faith, and they took them and put them in one of these machines that scans the brain like a CAT scan or a PET scan or whatever, and they said, okay, do your thing, pray, meditate, whatever. And they found invariably that a certain part of the brain lit up like a Christmas tree when they got into a state where they were really trying to, commune with the Almighty or meditate or become one with the universe, whatever the case might be. And they also noticed that at the same time, that part of the brain was releasing large amounts of feel-good chemicals like, endorphins and enkephalons and things like that. So the person was experiencing a deep sense of peace, a deep sense of bliss. And the thing is now, because they know this, they can target that part of the brain with these scalar weapons, with this mind snapper thing, and they can give people an artificial religious high that's very much like the real thing that you might experience. And so, people can be deceived, even as it says in the Word, that you can even deceive the elect into thinking that maybe they'll see the Antichrist on TV or whatever and get this real rush and feel all wonderful and gooey and warm inside, and before you know it, they're going to think this is the real thing. And it gets even better than that. You could have simulated UFO invasions. For example, many of you might remember the movie a few years ago, Independence Day, where they had these awesome, huge UFOs flying over New York City that were the size of Yankee Stadium. Well, you could have something very much like that. You could have a UFO land on the White House lawn, have it open up just like in that old movie, The Day the Earth Stood Still, and out would walk Jesus. Complete long white robes, long flowing hair, Sacred Heart bumping away, on his chest, and everybody would think, oh, it's the second coming. It's the apocalypse, and it's all fake. And remember what Ronald Reagan said years ago when he addressed the United Nations. He said that the one thing that would bring us together is if an alien force came and attacked the earth. And what's really interesting is at the end of that movie I mentioned a minute ago, Independence Day, they have this scene where all of these different air forces are coming together and they're going to fight off the enemy. And they actually show Arabs and Israelis working together, Talk about science fiction, amen? Anyway, so, there's all sorts of different ways that you can deceive people. Another thing is a lot of people nowadays, especially since that movie came out, Signs, are talking about crop circles. And there's people that study these things full time. They're called seriologists, believe it or not. And they believe these are messages from our space brothers. And this is another deception from the New World Order. And we've now learned that these can be made by, in fact, scalar plasma balls. And that makes sense because these people, these seriologists that will go and study these various crop circles, tell us that, first of all, there's very unusual electromagnetic activity around these formations. And secondly, they say that quite often there's a smell of ozone, which is, part of an electrical discharge. So I believe these things are being made to help, enhance people's faith in the space brothers that are coming to Earth to save us. And of course, that's the problem. People want to be saved, but they want to be saved by anybody but Jesus, Yeshua. They don't want the gospel. They don't want to obey him and to bow the knee and serve him. They just want to have someone come and fix it, and that's what these space brothers claim that they can do, because, there's various cult groups that are built around flying saucers. That one, Heaven's Gate, is the most infamous one, but there's many others, and they all promise salvation just by these people coming and taking away all of our war and all of our pollution and saving the earth. And again, it's going to be one big deception. Now, some people ask, well, how do you target these weapons? I mean, if I'm firing a weapon at a destroyer that's in the middle Atlantic Ocean, how on earth does that happen? Well, Tesla had that figured out. It's a weakly endothermic device that he devised. It's called the Big Eye. That was his name for it. And it can be used like over-the-horizon radar with remarkably good resolution. And because scalar energy is able to pass through the earth or through the ocean, there can be no hiding from this eye in tunnels or bunkers. In fact, a lot of people have said, They're Vietnam veterans. They said, I wish we had one of these things when we were in Vietnam, because the Viet Cong would be hiding in these tunnels. They call them tunnel rats. And with this, you could just see right through the ground and see them and just pick them off like fish in a barrel. And of course, unfortunately, they can do the same thing with us. This, of course, is the holy grail of naval warfare, because for years they've wanted an undersea radar that was undetectable. The problem is for us is, unlike sonar, the sub would have no idea that it's being detected or that it's being tracked. And then you could just hit it with one of these dudding effects and the thing would just drop to the bottom of the ocean and never be found again. Now, the military implications of this are obviously staggering. You can use these Tesla globes either for defense or for offense. You can use them to protect a city or to blow up a space shuttle. And there's virtually no end to the size of these things. For example, there was a London Times report back in 1980 August where a British cameraman by the way of Nick Downey was in Afghanistan, and he observed what he said were incredibly large Tesla, well, he didn't call them, of course, Tesla domes. He said they were large glowing domes appearing on the horizon, and they took up 20% of the skyline. And he estimated from that, because this guy was a photographer and he kind of knew about distances, that they were hundreds of miles in diameter. He saw these on numerous occasions in September of 1979 and December of 1979 near the Sarashagan Missile Test Facility, which is a Russian test facility near Afghanistan, and that's where they test their directed energy weapons. Now, additionally, there have been reports of these globes over the northern Pacific in 1982, over the northern Atlantic in 1976, and the more interesting one is there was a continuous Tesla fireball reported on September 10th, 1976. This was a British Eastern Airways jet that was flying from Moscow to London. It was flying at the time over Lithuania, which of course was part of the Soviet Union at that time. And as it flew over Russian airspace, it was night, and all of a sudden this brilliant, enormous ball filled the sky. I mean, they thought it was the sun, it was so bright. And they, of course, were very alarmed, and they called Russian ground authorities, and they reported this. And the Russian ground authorities were very terse, very harsh. They said, ignore that light and get out of there as fast as you can. That was all they would say. Now think about this. The Russians knew that plane was there. The military radar people knew it was there. The civilian radar people knew it was there. And yet they deployed this weapon. Why? They were doing it to ping British intelligence, MI6, to see if when these guys came back and reported it, there was any indication that they identified this as a Tesla device. And as far as we know, there was no ability to identify it. They were totally clueless. No evidence to the contrary. Here we see, these are some pictures of some mysterious plasma globes that were seen over Norway of various sizes, from as small as, say, one of those hot air balloons all the way up to several hundred feet in size. And this brings another interesting thing into the UFO picture, because a lot of UFOs could be explained by these Tesla plasma balls. See, one of the most puzzling things about UFOs is the fact that they display what is called non-ballistic motion. That means they're going along like this at a very high level of speed, maybe Mach 2 or Mach 3, and all of a sudden, boom, they go like that. And they make a very, very hard turn. Now, if you were a jet pilot in the U.S. Air Force and you were going at Mach 2 or Mach 3, and you were to make a turn like that, you'd end up as chunky salsa, because of the G-forces. And so everybody was saying, well, this must be some superior alien technology. But see, if all it was plasma globes, then, these things have virtually no mass. I mean, their mass is very negligible, so therefore there's no problem with inertia. You can just zoom all over the place with them, and it looks very impressive from the ground. So you never know. A lot of UFOs might be now explained by these things. Now, this is another example of how you can use Tesla shields to defend your city, if you have the technology, of course. Many of you have probably seen those Russian dolls. Well, they nest one doll inside of another doll inside of another doll. There's a word for it, but I forget what it is. Well, that's what they do here. They nest 3 Tesla globes, one inside of the other. And what happens here is that the energy comes along, like let's say there's an air burst over the city of Moscow. And what they do is they deploy these triple globes over the city. And there's gamma rays coming in from the burst. And that's, of course, the most lethal form of radiation from nuclear explosion, or gamma rays. Because if you get hit with gamma rays, depending on the range of how far away you were from the blast, they can either kill you in a few hours, a few days, or a few weeks with massive cancers and so on. Well, if this three-level thing is deployed, the gamma rays hit the outer ring, which is the red ring, and at that point, the power is pulled back, the frequency of the radiation is pulled back, and they become X-rays. Still pretty dangerous. They hit the second ring, and they're dialed down a little bit more. They hit the inner ring, the kind of yellow ring there, and at that point, they end up being powered down to the point that they're just simply radio waves. And of course, radio waves are relatively harmless because they're all around us here, and of course, obviously, we even listen to the radio. So this would, in effect, render even the power of an air burst absolutely harmless against an entire city. Now, here again, we're talking about Tesla globes and Tesla domes. This again, these were provided to me by a friend who's Air Force radar tech, and he says this particular one is an example of a Tesla dome because, again, it's hollow inside. Here's another one that's even more spectacular. This one is over the Brookhaven National Labs in Long Island, and that one actually gives me a little bit of hope because maybe that's one we're making. I mean, if it's exactly centered over a laboratory that we own, but of course, who knows, maybe it's just the Russians messing with our heads again. And then finally, this is an interesting one. This is actually an example of radar jamming. Notice how this one is solid, and where is it? It's over Area 51. Naturally, they're going to be jamming that airspace, and that's being done by our own government, of course. Now, I've mentioned several times these woodpecker beams and the woodpecker grid. If you look at the graphic there, you'll see that's what's going on. You'll see that there's over-the-horizon beams of energy coming across the Arctic Circle from the Soviet Union and crisscrossing over America. And these are done several times so that you have this enormous grid of energy right over North America. And this was, as I said earlier, this was deployed in July of 1976, and it's been online ever since. And people ask, well, what does that do exactly? Well, it does many things. That's the problem. Mainly, it's an over-the-horizon radar, but you can also use this grid, as I've already mentioned, to deploy scalar globes to either change our weather, to cause people to go crazy. You can use it to deploy weapons, as they did with the Challenger disaster, and you can also use it to cause mental or physical illness. We'll talk more about that a little later, but you can see there how those beams might intersect all over the nation in that fashion. Now, the question has been raised many times, if the Russians have had the power like this in so many ways to take us out for around 30 years, but they haven't, why is that? Well, fair question. There's a reason for this. The number one reason is that, of course, the times and the seasons are in the hand of Yahweh God. We don't know what his timetable is, and of course, obviously, neither do the Russians. So if this is going to happen, it's going to happen when he wants to and not 1 second before. But additionally, the Russians aren't the only nation with these weapons. There are 4 or 5 other nations that have these weapons, and some of them are our friends. And so over the years, we have actually had several occasions when the Russians were, in fact, deploying these weapons against us, and they were stopped by allies. The most obvious example here is in 1986, April. The Russians were sending energy towards both the LA and San Francisco corridor to try and create a massive earthquake that would cause catastrophic damage and loss of life. Well, some secretive little U.S. group, quote unquote, that had access to scalar technology themselves came in and fired back. And this caused a feedback loop which sort of bounced back all the way across to the Soviet Union and caused the Chernobyl disaster. And so that kind of taught them a lesson. Now, that was an unintended consequence of what they did. But the interesting thing is by doing that, they figure they've saved around 200,000 American lives. So, good for them. Then, in the same year, 1986, a friendly little nation prevented our nation's military infrastructure from being completely destroyed by an even more powerful scalar weapon attack from the Soviets. Now, even as recently as 1997, twice in 1 year, the U.S. came very close to being destroyed by scalar weapons, but the same little nation intervened on our behalf. However, what that means is that you have kind of a new version of that old mutual assured destruction thing, where essentially other nations have a scalar gun pointed at the head of the Russians, and they're saying, if you do something to America, we're going to do something worse to you. And that is partially, at least, what's keeping us from being totally destroyed by these things. But there are new threats on the horizon. And that's what I want to talk about now. And unfortunately, these aren't as easy to deal with. These newer threats come from rogue groups like the Yakuza, Aum Shinrikyo, and of course our most recent enemy is Islamic terrorist groups. Now, some of these might be unfamiliar to you, so I'm going to briefly discuss them. Aum Shinrikyo is a very weird Japanese doomsday cult. The words themselves mean sacred truth. And they believe it's their job to cause the end of the world. And to be blunt, they're basically whack jobs. And these people have done such horrible things as they unleashed sarin nerve gas in a Tokyo subway a decade ago on March 20th, 1995, caused 11 casualties and 5,000 injuries. They've done other things of a similar nature, and recently they changed their name to Aleph, which is kind of odd because that's the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Then there's the Yakuza. Some people compare these guys to like the mafia, but that's really doing a lot of justice more than needs to be to the mafia. These guys are far beyond the mafia. It's been called the mother of all crime syndicates, and it's a transnational organization.
I'm going to interrupt the broadcast right there because I want to give you the opportunity to get this DVD. It is awesome. It's called Russia's Secret Weapon to Defeat America by Bill Schnoebelen. Normally a gift of $30, but if you call today, you can get it for a gift of just $15. Call 785-266-1112. I don't think it's on the website for that price. You'll probably have to call 785-266-1112. Russia's Secret Weapon to Defeat America. Gift of $15 or more. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your prayers, and thank you for your gifts of support. God bless. Now from the Prophecy Club, some exciting opportunities for you. I've heard the testimonies of over 35 different people that have died and gone to heaven, but I think Dean Braxton's testimony is the best, simply because he spent the most time there. He spent 1 hour and 45 minutes in heaven. He tells you what Jesus and the Father and the throne looks like, and our new Jerusalem and our mansions, whether it's a pyramid or it's a square. Everything is based on love and is alive. How we communicate, whether we talk or just by thoughts, how we move, do we walk or do we fly, our relationships with our families and others, and our glorified bodies and garments and what they look like. Normally valued at $30, but you can call a Prophecy Club and get it right now for just a gift of $15 or more. That's 785-266-1112. I spent 45 minutes in heaven by Dean Braxton. 785-266-1112 or prophecyclub.com. We know that a disaster and rioting in our streets is coming, and the number one cause of death after a disaster is contaminated water, because the average person can't go more than 3 days without clean water. You can run contaminated water through a Berkey and drink it immediately, which is why the missionaries choose Berkey. I recommend a Royal Berkey with 4 filters for a gift of $406 plus shipping. Call 785-266-1112 or go to prophecyclub.com and see our entire line of Berkey filters.